hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. Hopefully you guys hear me okay here, but let me know if you can't hear me for some reason or if you want me to speak up. So welcome. While we're waiting for people to come in, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. First, please mute your lines. We will have time at the end for questions and answers, but feel free to ask any questions during the webinar. You can ask them by either typing into the chat box here on the right side, or on the top bar you can click raise hand and that will grant you microphone access. Please turn off any applications or windows that you're not using to conserve bandwidth. And then just so you're aware, this is being recorded and we will post it to our website after the webinar. And if you want to take notes or you want today's slides, they're available at this bottom pod for download. So I'm excited to introduce our speakers today. We have Dr. Mebola Campbell and Dr. Mita Goyal. Dr. Campbell is an assistant professor here at Northwestern, and she developed and piloted a social determinants of health curriculum for internal medicine residents, and it's now expanding into an institution-wide health equity and advocacy clinical scholars program where she'll serve as the program director. Dr. Goyal is an associate professor here at Northwestern, and her work as a health services researcher and medical educator focuses on promoting health equity. She also serves as a leader for the undergraduate health equity and advocacy curriculum here at Feinberg. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started, and I will pass things over to Mita.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're on. It's exciting to be here to discuss this really important topic of teaching social determinants of health in graduate medical education. It's my pleasure to be presenting with the support of Lauren Gard and with the collaboration with Mebola Campbell. We have no relevant financial disclosures. And today, by the end of the webinar, we hope that participants will be able to describe a framework for teaching social determinants of health in the graduate medical education setting, and largely have a systematized approach for how you would develop a curriculum to teach social determinants of health. We have to identify gaps and opportunities in existing programs to teach trainees about the social determinants of health, and lastly, to develop an outline of social determinants of health curriculum by taking some of the information that we're giving, frameworks that we're going to be talking about, and considering how you could adapt those to your home institution. And so with that in mind, I'm going to start off by describing a literature review that we conducted here looking at a variety of curricula in graduate medical education programs designed to teach social determinants of health. And then I'm going to pass off to Mebola, who is going to talk about a few examples of social determinants of health curricula at institutions that have really considered this very carefully and thought about this, and talk specifically about experiences that we have here at Northwestern in the internal medicine residency program, and then also developing a health equity and advocacy scholars program that Mebola has spearheaded. And lastly, ending with lessons learned and leaving time for about minutes at the end for questions. So with that format, I'm going to kick off the discussion around the literature review of the graduate medical education social determinants of health curricula. So why are we focusing on graduate medical education? And so it's important to think about this for a moment. Residency training is the last point of formal training that most primary care providers have before practicing. As a result, it's really important to think of this as the last formal opportunity to train our providers in addressing social determinants of health. Despite this being the terminal training, resident surveys often indicate a lack of confidence in addressing social determinants of health, so it feels like we are graduating residents that don't feel prepared to practice in the real-world setting. Also, currently, many of the competencies put out by the ACGME are somewhat vague. They don't explicitly include assessing and addressing social determinants of health across the board. For example, within the internal medicine competencies, there are some that include some social determinants of health, such as consider individual patients' needs when providing care, but that can be interpreted quite broadly. As a result, we don't really have best practices in effective training for social determinants of health at the graduate medical education level. So to address this need, and to understand what is being done right now, we did a scoping review, so basically a systematic review of the literature. And I have up here a picture of one of our incredibly valuable individuals, Corinne Miller, who was involved with our project as a librarian here, who assisted us with conducting the literature review. We searched 7 different databases and developed specific search terms for each of those individual databases that largely focused on a variety of different ways of looking at social determinants of health within graduate medical education, and primary care as the key determinants. We also limited our search to all articles published within the last 10 years that were published in English, took place in the United States, and focused on primary care residency programs. This is just to show that there were a lot of articles that we pulled up from those 7 different databases. We had a team that reviewed all of the citations pulled in, applied the inclusion criteria that I described again, that they were primary care programs, graduate medical education, social determinants of health within the last 10 years published in English in the United States, and gradually narrowed to the point where there were 43 articles that we looked at. And here's what we found. We found that there were a wide variety of approaches to developing curriculum. So it's not to say that the programs didn't necessarily have a specific approach, but not all of them described them within the papers that we found. The large majority that were in the 43 articles that we had, represented in the dark purple on this pie chart, did not describe how they developed their curriculum. A number of others took on-the-ground approaches of either tapping expert faculty, as you see in the green wedge, conducting a literature review in the light purple wedge, conducting resident focus groups to understand what learner needs are in the light green. In purple, we have multidisciplinary inputs. These were quite interesting in programs that considered what the needs of community partners were, what the learners were, what expert faculty were, a number of different inputs to develop their curriculum. And some, as in the orange wedge here, focused on using conceptual framework. So what do we know from the literature about approaches to social determinants of health and considered content in that manner? And so the first take-home point from the literature review was, consider carefully how you use a systematic approach to select your curricular content. Having a very specific approach will allow you to think about what the needs of your patient populations, your learners, and your educational institution might be. It also allows you to carefully consider what topics you're selecting and prevents you from unintentionally omitting important social determinants of health content. Often curricula may be filling quick needs, which is understandable, but when thinking about the broader universe of topics related to social determinants of health, taking a systematic approach to curricular content will allow you to more robustly develop your objectives. And Dr. Campbell Mabola is going to be talking about this in more detail about how to operationalize that thought around a systematic approach to curricular content selection. There was also quite a bit of variation in implementation, and I pulled out just 3 of the different types of dimensions of implementation to give you an idea of what they were. So 14 of the 43 programs that we had were longitudinal, meaning that they had curricula that ran for greater than 6 months. This is important to consider within the specific constraints of your individual program, whether it is helpful to have more intensive brief interventions or curricula, or whether it's possible to have longitudinal curricula. A small handful, only 17, had mandatory participation. Many of these were electives that residents could opt into participating in. Again, this is important to consider when you think about, are these programs relevant for you? Are you trying to launch a curriculum that is going to impact all of your learners within your residency program, or only some? And lastly, roughly half included experiential components in some form of clinical or community setting. That is to say that roughly half of them did not have experiential components. So these are, again, important to think about when you consider what the resources you have at your individual institution are and what limitations might be. There are a number of other things to think about with implementation as well that I'm going to briefly touch upon. So the vast majority actually used more than one way of teaching. While there were a small number that used only one type of teaching, like didactics, or two that used exclusively online curricula, over half combined different modalities of teaching, so didactics, experiential, etc. So take-home message 2 when developing social determinants of health curricula is selecting an educational strategy in an explicit manner, in picking a strategy that is going to allow you to deliver content that best achieves your objectives for teaching within the context of your institution. We were pleasantly surprised to find very effective curricula, I'll get to that in a moment, that were brief and those that were longitudinal. So finding something that fits your program seems to be a very achievable strategy. And lastly, I'm going to talk about assessment. So how did we know if these curricula achieved what they set out to do? Well, to begin with, many did not look at any outcome. So that is in that dark purple pie chart. And some looked at post-test only, as you can see in the darker green here. So it's very hard to know whether these were high-quality studies or not. Within our formal systematic review, we evaluated them using a tool called the Mirsky tool that formally evaluates the quality of the assessments that were conducted. And we found that really just a small handful achieved the higher levels of quality assessments. So consider that again as you're looking at different programs out there. Look at not just whether there was an assessment, but how accurate that assessment is to what you think is the true outcome for the curricular goal. There are a few that use pre-post tests in that light purple bar, in the light purple pie piece. There are some that actually conducted randomized controlled trials and non-randomized controlled trials as well. So as you can see, there are a variety of different assessments that are strategies for assessing. In addition, there are lots of different types of assessments that can be conducted. For those of you that are familiar with this, this is a more where they talk about different levels of impact of your curriculum that you can achieve. At the base of the pyramid is simple participation in the curriculum. And as we get closer to the tip, it looks at what is the impact of your curriculum on patient health and community health. Those are very, very high bars of effect to show from your curriculum. However, if you look there, there are a fair number that looked at whether resident performance was influenced as a result of the curriculum. So the last take-home message is, when you're assessing your curriculum, consider what the highest level assessment that you can conduct that is feasible. It may be that it is far too challenging or resource intensive to look at whether resident behavior is changed, but you may be able to look at different kinds of procedural or declarative knowledge. And Mabola is going to talk again a little bit more about a real-world example of how to select an assessment that reflects the level that you're aiming to achieve with your curriculum. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Mabola to describe some of the real-world experiences in developing and assessing curricula.
Great, thanks, Nita. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share our experience here at Northwestern in the internal medicine residency program. And just to give you a bit of background, I will speak about how we saw the need for a social determinants of health curriculum when we started the program. We didn't have the benefit of this wonderful scoping review that Mita and her group had done, and so we relied on a few other pieces of data. And we looked at the need from a patient care standpoint as well as an educational standpoint. I'm sure everyone's well familiar with the Institute of Medicine report on unequal treatment from almost 20 years ago now, which described health and healthcare disparities in the U.S. And every year we have AHRQ report on the National Report of Disparities, and we see that those disparities continue to exist in the country. And so there's an obvious need from a patient care standpoint. From the educational standpoint, we have the ACGME's requirements and the CLARE guidelines for our residents and fellows to be trained in healthcare disparities identification and management. We also know that educators have identified gaps in training for social determinants of health, and we know that this training, or the lack thereof, impacts our trainees' career goals if they choose to continue on with their desire to serve in underserved areas. And so knowing all this, I looked in literature to see specific to internal medicine what the thoughts were around 2016 when we started looking at developing this curriculum. So the first slide you see there is a national survey of internal medicine program directors assessing their views about training in social determinants of health and public health issues and health disparities. And I've highlighted a few important topics. From the top you can see community resources for the uninsured or underinsured. And the second line is health advocacy. And the third and fourth in the bottom are health disparities and social determinants of health. As you move from the left to the right, you see the programs starting to separate out into categorical programs as well as primary care internal medicine programs. What percentage of those programs included these topics in their core curriculum? So this was mandatory for every single resident in their program to receive these topics. And the second part is the elective curriculum. So this was elective. Not every resident was able to participate or chose to participate in this. And on the bottom two sections, health disparities and social determinants of health, there were 0 programs which included these topics in their core curriculum. We had a better success in primary care programs, of which 73% included health disparities and about 46% included social determinants of health in their core curriculum. In the elective portions, categoricals did have some training in this, and you can see 55% included topics of health disparities and about 37% had it in their elective curriculum for social determinants of health. So this obviously shows that there are gaps in our curriculum in training and internal medicine. We'll move on to the next slide, which was a survey from AIM, looking at what barriers program directors could identify in implementing curriculum on health disparities and cultural competency. And the two most common reasons they identified were lack of faculty expertise and not enough time. And these are important issues we see quite a bit in our programs, and I'll speak about these in the next few slides. The last piece of evidence I want to share is an important report from the ACGME's CLARE report of findings in 2016. There were CLARE visits to about 300 ACGME institutions of residency and fellowship programs between 2012 and 2015. And it was important that across most sites, they found that education and training on healthcare disparities and cultural competence was generic and did not address specific populations served by the institution. And the final report stated there is a substantive deficiency in preparing residents and fellows to both identify and address disparities in healthcare outcomes, as well as ways to minimize or eliminate them. So this is great data. We could see that there's a need. And so how did we proceed from there? I ended up looking around in literature to see what existed and what I could learn from those existing social determinants of health curricula. There were quite a few, but I want to highlight two specific programs that I was particularly impressed with and I'd like to share with you. The first is from the Cambridge Health Alliance, and this was their report that was published in Academic Medicine about a year ago. They had a social medicine and health advocacy curriculum that was initially a 1-month elective for about 5 years. And then starting in 2012, it became a required year-long longitudinal curriculum. They had about 100 hours of instruction, and they organized it into two-week immersion blocks. And then over the course of the year, they had sessions, about 2 to 4 hour sessions of didactics where they taught these residents on different topics pertaining to health equity and social determinants of health. They had 3 domains: health equity, social determinants of health and health policy, health services research methods, as well as social change, leadership, and advocacy. We don't have any results yet. Their qualitative and quantitative data collection is still in progress, but I'm really looking forward to the findings from this program. The next program is from UCSF, which is the Health Equities track centered at San Francisco General Hospital. And their curriculum involved about 75 hours of instruction over the course of 1 to 2 years. And they had a series of seminars, lectures, field trips, as well as case conferences. And at the end, all the residents were required to complete scholarly projects that were either community-based or advocacy-focused. So with these 2 and a few other curricula in mind, we decided to proceed with our curriculum. So to set the stage, I will take you back to June of 2016 when I met with the internal medicine program director. As faculty, I was interested in developing this curriculum for a few different reasons. One, because in my practice as a hospitalist, I knew the importance of training and being confident and competent in addressing these issues for my patients, as well as being an attending on the teaching service and the residents requesting more and more training in this. And the third was a bit more of a selfish reason. I was involved in a teaching fellowship at my institution, and we were required to have a medical education research project. So this would double as my research project. We began discussing and planning in June 2016, and we anticipated the curriculum would start in the middle of the academic year. And for everyone listening, that's not the best time to start a curriculum, but we were constrained by time. So a few questions we had were, who are the learners? Was this going to be for the entire residency program or for a select group? How could we fit this into the current academic year? The rotation schedule was already out, and we had to fit this in somehow. What time would work best for the residents? Would it be in the morning, at noon, or sometime at the end of the day? What would the format be? What structure would the curriculum have? Who would be the instructor? And I think the answer was obvious. It would be myself. We needed to think about what barriers existed for this program, for this curriculum, and would this curriculum be sustainable? Was this going to be a one-time thing and we couldn't sustain it over the course of the years? Or how could we make sure it would be sustainable? And so with those questions in mind, I turned to the National Academy of Sciences report, which thankfully came out earlier that year, and provided a framework for me to base the curriculum on. And so it was a foundation that I could start to build up this curriculum upon. And so the 3 domains I try to focus and make sure were included were education of the residents, how this tied in with our institution and organization's missions and vision, and how this would address our community. And we are in Chicago, and there's specific issues that impact our patients here in the Chicago area. And so those were 3 major domains that needed to be addressed in this curriculum. And in building the curriculum and the details, I turned to the Bible of curriculum development, which is fondly known as CURNS, but it's the Curriculum Development for Medical Education, a 6-step approach. And I've listed the 6 steps here, and we'll go in more detail through each step over the next few slides. So the first step is problem identification and general needs assessment. Nita has done a great job, and I was also able to find in literature from the CLARE report, the national surveys, we know that there's a need. We know that there's a gap in our curriculum for residents and fellows, and so that's obvious. And also, we realized in our program that it's what we have in terms of training and social determinants of health was more informal, ad hoc teaching on the fly. If you happen to have a faculty member or a great social worker on the floor who could take you through this, the residents were able to learn about it. And not everyone got to partake of that teaching or training. The targeted needs assessment was the second part, and this was where my discussion with the program director was very helpful because he knew all the different parts of the program and where the specific gaps were. He knew what the residents lacked in terms of training and was able to help me gain that knowledge and address it in the curriculum development. I also had anecdotal reports from the residents who were requesting more training, so that was helpful. A third piece of evidence I want to share and that is informing the further iterations of this curriculum is the Healthy Chicago 2.0, which is a report produced by our Chicago Department of Public Health, which outlines the public health issues that are specific to our city. And that was definitely helpful as I began to deliver the content and make the residents aware of issues that were specific to Chicago, to the communities, and the patients we serve. There are other methods by which you can conduct a targeted needs assessment, just so you're aware. Formal interviews, focus groups like Mita shared, surveys are definitely ways you can get additional information. Moving on to our goals and objectives, we definitely wanted to make sure we had SMART goals, but we're also aware that this was going to be a pilot curriculum, and so starting small and having early wins was important. And while the holy grail is to definitely change behaviors, impact patients, we knew that we'd probably start off with changing their attitudes and improving their knowledge, as well as training them with specific skill sets for them to be able to identify and address social determinants of health. So those are some things that we considered and you should also as you develop your curriculum. For educational strategies, we had a mix of didactics and case-based discussions. We wanted to make sure that it was interactive. We had small groups, and so just to be a bit more specific, our second year class has about 40 residents. And we divided the residents into two cohorts, so 20 in the first cohort and 20 in the second, just to make it a bit more manageable. And these 20 residents were further divided into groups of 10, and so I delivered the content at least 2 or 3 times over each month so that all 20 residents could receive that portion of the curriculum. The small group setting was important to make sure everyone was engaged, that it was a psychologically safe space as we discussed these sensitive issues and as people share their experiences. And it could be different for your program, but that is definitely what worked in ours, and we saw that in the evaluations and the reflections of the residents. We wanted to incorporate technological tools, and one important thing I used was Poll Everywhere, and if you Google it, you can go to the website, it's free. I have no stock in it, but it was very helpful because when it helped to make sure the residents were engaged. When I asked questions, instead of waiting for them to put their hand up or move from the inertia of listening, they were able to engage with their phones and text in their results, and it made for very rich discussion between all the residents and learning for me also. I think it's important to remember as you think about your educational strategies. So if you think about adult learning theory, I wanted to make sure I incorporated strategies that helped the residents develop their self-efficacy, engage in reflective practice. This was something I wanted them not just to leave the sessions and forget, but to think about every time they saw a patient, every time they engaged with their patients in clinic or on the wards, and just continue to see how they could improve their practice. So I will give you details of what we did in terms of implementation. The pilot began in February and ran over about 6 months until about August of 2017. And we were able to deliver the content to the entire PGY2 class, all 40 of the residents. It was a mandatory curriculum, and so they all had to show up. However, the research portion, where I collected specific data, was elective, and 2/3 of the class consented to be part of the study. I served as the instructor, and there was no funding for me. I was doing this as a research project, and I did not receive salary support for this, and that was fine. However, the Department of Medicine was very gracious in providing funding for dinner for the residents. And so the modules were timed at 5 to 6:15-ish p.m. In the evening after the residents had finished their clinical rotations for the day. And to incentivize them and encourage them to show up, we provided dinner. And I would send reminder pages to them to ensure they didn't forget and that dinner was provided. And so that definitely helps with the show rate. There were 3 modules that were delivered, and there was 1 module per month. The first was in social determinants of health, the second was in health disparities, and the third was in social justice. I've listed some of the examples we addressed, and for each of those topics, I presented the general national data, but I also searched for data specific to Chicago, and this was something the residents in their evaluations and reflections that they appreciated. They appreciated seeing how this affected the patients they took care of, where the food deserts were in Chicago, how access to health, care was important. We talked about violence in Chicago and use of interpreters and health advocacy issues, and that was important to them because they were being equipped with the knowledge and skill with which to care for their patients. Some of the resources I used included the SGIM Disparities Task Force Train the Trainer Guide, which is amazing. I definitely utilized the IOM reports, the AHRQ, National Disparities Report. The CDC has is also a great resource, and as I mentioned, the Healthy Chicago 2.0. In addition, we had our social worker come in, and this was great because we had an interprofessional aspect to this curriculum, and she was able to share her perspective as a social worker on how the residents could begin to address these issues, could advocate for their patients, and how we could align with the patients' goals for better health. And lastly, we obtained reflections from the residents after each module. They would get a link to a questionnaire where they would have some questions about what they thought about the topic, how it would change their practice, and if it wouldn't, why not. And these were really rich data that, as I continue to analyze, has informed the rest of the curriculum. For our evaluation, I ended up focusing more on Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, which somewhat aligns with Moore's that Mita presented. And on the bottom, looking at reaction, were they satisfied? Were they happy with the curriculum? Following that, learning, did they gain the knowledge? Did they gain any skills? The third, behavior, did they change their behavior and transfer that learning to their practice, their clinical practice, as they saw patients in clinic and on the wards? And the top, most important, was there any impact on society, benefit to the patient, change in our organizational practice? And so what I did was I had pre and post surveys that I developed, and that was sourced from different articles that I saw available, and I'm happy to share those. And I was more evaluating their self-assessment of their confidence in addressing these issues. Was there a change in their attitude? But I think outside of these surveys, the richest data I got was from the reflections and the semi-structured interviews we had at the end of the curriculum. And I'll share some of those in the next few slides. So here are some of the reflections we got from the residents. The question I asked is, will the curriculum impact your clinical practice? And if so, how? And the first said, yes, I liked our discussion about practical ways to encourage lifestyle modification, counseling on diet, focusing on the areas in which patients live in terms of shaping recommendations for food options and food deserts, and how to increase physical activity in unsafe neighborhoods. Another said, having a better understanding of social determinants of health will allow me to consider these factors before finalizing my treatment plans for patients, thinking about affordability of medications, patients' educational levels. And the third said, today I spent an extra 5 minutes talking to my clinic patient about the neighborhood he lives in, if he feels safe and who supports them. While most of the reflections were positive, it was also helpful to have some that weren't all positive and happy, but it was interesting to see this perspective and to see how we can change how we teach and how we practice also. So this resident said, I think it's difficult to implement some of the things we discussed practically in clinic. It's hard enough to even complete the basic return visit tasks in the time allotted for each patient, let alone assessing the various social determinants of health and then addressing them. The demand from a volume and time standpoint in physicians is already too high. Asking residents to get involved in community outreach seems far-fetched or putting in 60-hour weeks. And so this is definitely one of the more important areas I'm looking at as I analyze their semi-structured interview transcripts and reflections. What are the barriers they see in actually implementing what we're teaching them and in engaging in advocacy for their patients? And one of the most important things they've said is time constraints and competing responsibilities. And that is helpful as we move ahead with the curriculum. This was the formal evaluation that they completed. Majority of them said it helped them understand social determinants of health better. It was the right format, the right time, it was well organized. And in the comments, they shared that they appreciated having a forum to discuss sensitive issues. They're going to be more aware of interactions and how they can make big changes for patients and remind themselves of the privilege they have to advocate for those in need. And so just in rounding up, I wanted to share the challenges and limitations we had, and there were many. The first was curricular content. There was no way I could cover everything I wanted to teach them about social determinants of health. And so how could we choose and prioritize what we would include in these small and in this short amount of time we had? Second was about timing and logistics. It was not ideal for many of the residents at the end of the day to come as much as we tried to incentivize and encourage with food. But they were tired, and that time definitely is something we're looking at changing because it wasn't an optimal time for them. The residents perceived limitations in self-efficacy and implementing what they learned was important to note also. And so while they were engaged during the discussions and the sessions, do they feel empowered and able to go out and practice this? The experiential component is key, and if you can see in my slides, we did not have an experiential component incorporated into this curriculum. One of the reasons being that the time constraints we had was already, the academic year was already set, and we had to fit this in somehow. But it's something we're looking into in further iterations. My expectation for this was that they would take what they learned and go into their next clinic visit or their next inpatient ward rotation and start to apply it. And the last is that community partnership needs to be developed and maintained. So we definitely need to engage with our communities and have them fully incorporated into the care of the patients as well as the community. So a few other things that I wanted to share were that this article that came out earlier this year and was actually how we came about the title of this webinar. It was a call for action, and we're answering the call. And so this article highlighted key principles for social determinants of health implementation. The first being that the curriculum must be universal and integrated into broader educational programming. So not just a specific class, but the entire residency program should be able to receive this curriculum. Should be seamless integration into clinical education and conferences, morning report across all your training sites. And you should create opportunities to stimulate trainee introspection and reflection, define specific competencies and identification and mitigation of social determinants of health. And we definitely need robust faculty development programming. And so to preview our Scholars program, having developed this pilot curriculum, it was well received by our residents. We started to hear from other departments and programs that they also wanted to see something like this in their residency program. And so outside of internal medicine, we heard from physical medicine and rehabilitation, emergency medicine residents we're interested in. So our Office of Graduate Medical Education is expanding the curriculum institution-wide into a clinical fellows program, which is elective. It will be a 2-year program, which I describe as our curriculum on steroids. And it is essentially to train residents and fellows to identify and address issues relating to health equity and advocacy so they can improve the health and health outcomes for their patients and communities. The template for our certificate programs here at Northwestern, and we already have 3 in existence, is that the programs typically have didactics, workshops, asynchronous learning, so book chapters, webinars, podcasts. They have an experiential component incorporated, and the residents and trainees produce a scholarly product at the end. And that is the same template that this program will have. And so the initial steps I've taken are to identify stakeholders within Northwestern and in the community to determine the scope of the program. Our pediatrics and family medicine colleagues already have a really robust community health, community medicine curriculum, and so how does this overlap with them? We want to make sure we're not duplicating their efforts. Are there resources for funding for our community partners, as well as resources for faculty and administrative support? And yes, we do have that. And I also met with our community advisory board early in the planning to get their input on what a program like this should look like. It's important that we align with the community, and so identify what are the community's needs, how does the curriculum fit in addressing those needs, and are there tangible products that the trainees and the communities can work together towards. So next steps are I continue to meet with the residency program directors to share more about this program. The residents and fellows are hearing about this in an information session. We're formalizing relationships with our community partners and as well as clinical and research partnerships. And we'll be returning to the community advisory board as they hear their additional input as we develop a bit more of a curriculum and program. This program will launch in fall of 2018. We're very excited. It's a lot of work, but we've gotten definitely interest from residents and fellows from across the institution. So just finishing up in the last minute, lessons learned these are lessons I've learned from the semi-structured interviews that we're still collecting. But knowing that the medical school is teaching, many of the medical schools are incorporating social determinants of health into their curriculum. We definitely have residents graduating med school and coming into our programs with a bit of this knowledge. But there are also residents who did not receive this in medical school. And so from the interviews, we found that those who did not receive the instruction in med school were excited and that they gained awareness about social determinants of health, and they had a formal curriculum for this. And those who had received it said that the curriculum was a refresher, and it reinforced and renewed their desire to engage in advocacy and continue to address social determinants of health. They felt it was particularly relevant at this stage because now they're actually seeing patients and can engage and can incorporate it in their clinical practice. And so while the medical school social determinants of health curriculum is foundational, we need to continue building on that foundation. They also felt empowered to make change, and they appreciated the focus on Chicago, our community, what are our homelessness rates, the food deserts, and the issues that affect our patients. And lastly, this was a co-creation of the curriculum with the learners because each iteration, as I delivered it to each cohort, I tweaked and improved it based on their feedback. And so the take-home points are we've seen a clear need for social determinants of health curriculum in GME programs. There is not one right way. You've heard about many different ways, and so you will have to figure out what works best for your institution, for your community, and for your program, how your learners learn best. And you can definitely pick and choose from all the existing curriculum and just pick best practices from them and what works best for you. Consider your local community and vulnerable populations, and leverage your institution's resources and align with your organization's mission. There will be barriers, but try to be creative and flexible, and they can be overcome. And the goal is for lifelong education in this. UME-CCN. That we will take questions. Thank you.
So thank you so much to Mita and Mabola. We have time for questions. Again, you can either type in the chat box, or if you look at the top bar, you'll see a little icon with the person raising their hand. You can click on that to access the microphone. So we've got one person taking a question. So the question is, are there any validated tools for assessing efficacy on these curricula?
Good question. In our review, this is Mita Goyle speaking, in our systematic review of the literature, there were not clear tools for assessing the efficacy of an overall social determinants of health curriculum. However, there are a few validated tools for assessing things such as use of interpreters. So depending again on what the content of your curriculum will be, whether it is broad or narrow, there may be validated tools that are available. However, there's not sort of an overarching tool that we were able to find.
Right.
Mabola, what are
I
your
think
thoughts?
that's important to remember, because at the end of the day, it's more about you evaluating your program and what are your goals when you develop the program. So if you, as you focus on specific skills, you can assess and use those tools, but also be creative and think about maybe an OSCE or incorporating simulation might be something you want to think about, or is it engagement with the community partners? So the overarching goal for your program might be something that you end up developing more as a program evaluation, as opposed to, does this work for social determinants of health, period.
To answer your question, yes, this is recorded, and I'll send out a follow-up email. Oh, I got a raised hand. I'll send out a follow-up email with the link of where you can find the recording, and I'm gonna, okay, you should have access to the microphone. So, apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name right, but 80, if you should have access now. Go ahead and try talking into the phone. Let me know if it's going through. Well, we'll keep working on that. Are there any other questions in the meantime? Well, feel free to type any other questions. I just, again, want to thank Mabola and Mita for their time, and thank you all for joining us. If you have time, please fill out our evaluation form. It helps us improve our future webinars. And then these webinars are hosted by the National Collaborative for Education to Address the Social Determinants of Health. We're a HRSA-funded collaborative. A few of our grant officers, I think, on the call with us. If you're interested in getting involved or collaborating, please reach out to me at lauren.guard@northwestern.edu. And then continue the conversation with us and follow us on Twitter. We love interacting with everybody. Oh, and we have another question. So what is the best way to align your goals and objectives to measurable outcomes?
For me, it was, I think, from your targeted needs assessment, you can know where the gaps are and what the needs of your learners are, and then determining whether it is a knowledge issue or it's a skills issue. That can help you start to think about measurement. And so I think Mita has mentioned there's some tools if it's skills, and if it's knowledge, I didn't see any tools in terms of knowledge, and it might be something you end up having to develop. lots of this is, many of these are still in development, and so this is definitely an opportunity for us to collaborate and work together and develop these tools.
Lisa? I'd like to reinforce some important points that Mabola has made, that part of this is a progression because the curricula that we are looking at so far are pretty varied, and many of them have differing goals and objectives. That there's an important point to align your goals and objectives to your institution first and foremost, making sure that they're relevant for your learners, for your patient populations, and for your institution. And once you're able to actually clearly develop what the goals and objectives of your curriculum are, that's a natural extension to measuring what the outcome should be. And there may or may not be existing tools for measuring what your outcome is. And that may vary depending on what your institutional resources are. So again, if you are looking to change behavior but don't have the ability to measure, to look at resident notes or referral rates, then that may not be a realistic, measurable outcome to achieve. And so you may want to consider what are other measurable outcomes that are feasible for you to obtain.
Any other questions? If not, we will be sticking around for a few more minutes in case anyone has last-minute questions. Again, thank you so much to our speakers and for all of you for joining us. Again, this is recorded, and I'll be posting it to our website later this week, and I'll send out a follow-up email with a link and including the slides from today's webinar. All right, well, it looks like there's no other questions, so we'll go ahead and stop recording at this point. Thank you again, and have a great day.